Shabbat Shalom again.
Shabbat Shalom.
This Shabbat marks our first communal Kabbalat Shabbat service back in our beloved Perlman Sanctuary since March 6th of 2020. Over 100 Friday nights exiled from normative Kabbalat Shabbat sacred space, just one of the countless losses absorbed in the black hole of time marked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Little did we know back then what a turning point that night would be and the uncharted waters we would be forced into as a result. That Shabbat, I happened to be the rabbi to offer the sermon, and I went back and read that sermon this week. Here are its concluding words. Judaism has always understood that it is the moments of chaos that ultimately show us who we are, and as such, it continues to invite us to remember that the strongest antidotes to whatever threatens to pull us apart will always be the power of hope, the power of love, and the power of community. And the production of those forces is entirely in our own control. The power of hope, the power of love, the power of community. I know I've relied heavily on these forces to get through these past 2 years. I imagine you have too. And now here we sit at the precipice of what I pray marks the transition to the other side, at least a bit, of this pandemic. As this latest peak has drastically declined, and with the miracles, truly miracles, of vaccination and effective treatment options, we find ourselves at another turning point. But I have to say, in many ways, the waters into which we now will immerse will likely feel just as uncharted as they did 2 years ago. The world is new, and even the most stable of our lives' fixtures won't necessarily look the same as they did before. For some of us, so much has been lost. For others, so much has been found. And there are many of us that feel the truth of both sentiments. For some of us, the impending lifting of the mask mandate undoubtedly brings incredible excitement and joy. For others, it surely brings concern, if not profound fear. And there are many of us that feel the truth of both sentiments. What will life on this new side be like? What will life here at NSCI be like? How will we ever come back to each other together? As is often the case in times when I am not sure of a path, I turn to the wisdom of Torah to provide direction. And wouldn't you know it, I didn't have to look beyond the first word of this week's Torah portion, the same word which gives the portion its name, vayakel in Hebrew. But before I define that word, a little context from where we find ourselves in the narrative, in the place where the people have just endured incredible chaos, trauma, and division. As you may remember, last week's Torah portion, Ki Tisa, described the infamous golden calf episode. After having not seen Moses for a long time, remember he's been up on Mount Sinai with God, getting all the commandments, the people feel the need, the urge really, for a visible connection to God. And they compel Aaron, Moses' brother, to appease their anxiety by building them a golden sculpted calf. In a frenzy, our ancestors bow down and worship what they've created. It's the number one no-no in the book. And almost immediately, there is a significant divide among the people. There is violence. There is plague, there is turmoil. By the portion's conclusion, Moses convinces God to forgive the people and a reset of sorts occurs. But because of all they've been through, the path to moving forward together proves notably obscured. And this is where this week's Torah portion begins and opens with these words, Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Moses then vayakeled the whole Israelite congregation. Immediately after that, Moses presents the people with a 2-item to-do list. One, to observe Shabbat, namely to abstain from any work, and then the other, to make donations to the first capital campaign. Literally. It's not a novel idea that synagogues have. This capital campaign so that they might build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable synagogue which would accompany them, manifesting the presence of God wherever they would journey for the next 40 years. So what does this Hebrew word vayakel mean? Well, it's usually translated as gathered or convened, but it has an important nuance that can only be discerned from its root, kuf he lamed, kahal, or perhaps kehila. Does anybody know or recognize those words, kahal, kehila? Yeah, Mrs. Hainsfurther. Congregation, community. So really, the word doesn't just mean gathering people physically in proximity with one another. It means transforming them from a group of disparate individual people into a unified body, a community, a congregation for a shared and ideally higher purpose. In the case of our portion, for Shabbat, the creation of sacred time, and for the Mikdash, the tabernacle, the creation of sacred space. The only 2 vehicles which, according to our tradition, were capable of allowing people to access holiness in its purest and highest forms, Shabbat and sanctuary. Which might seem a bit unrelatable in our world today, except for something about which I was reminded while reading a commentary by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. In his remarks, he cited research by Robert Putnam and David Campbell from their 2010 masterwork, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us. If you have not read this book, you really must. One of their key positive conclusions was that despite the trends of Western society toward self-interest, there remained yet one powerful store of social capital, and it could be found uniquely and only in places of worship. Their survey data showed that frequent church or synagogue goers were more likely to give money to charity, regardless of whether the charity was religious or secular. They were also more likely to do voluntary work, give money to a homeless person, spend time with someone who was feeling depressed, offer a seat to a stranger, help someone else find a job. On almost every measure, they were demonstrably more altruistic than non-worshipers. We're not talking about affiliation. We're talking about attending and worshiping. But there was more. Frequent worshipers were also significantly more active citizens. They were more likely to belong to community organizations, neighborhood and civic groups, and professional associations. Of note is that Putnam went so far as to speculate that an atheist who went regularly to synagogue, perhaps because of a spouse or some other reason, would be more likely to volunteer or give to charity than a religious believer who prayed alone. And the margin of difference between them and the more secular was grand. Tested on attitudes, religiosity as measured by church or synagogue attendance was the best predictor of altruism and empathy, better than education, age, income, gender, or race. Perhaps the most interesting of Putnam's findings was that these attributes were not related to people's religious beliefs per se, but to the frequency with which they attended a place of worship. And ultimately, their findings revealed the following equation. Religious practice, regardless of belief, creates community. Community creates altruism, and altruism turns us away from self and toward the common good, providing for us the tools to traverse any unknown landscape with hope, with love, and with each other, all through Shabbat and all through sanctuary. The difference, though, between back in the time of our Torah portion and today is that we no longer get a Moses. We no longer get a single person to vayakel us, to turn us into a community, to bring us together from the disparate points at which we find ourselves. As much as we, your clergy, would want to compel anyone and everyone to be here, to return, ultimately it's each person that will be responsible for their own regathering in this community, an ingathering of our day. No different from how it's been for the past 2 years, each and every person today and tomorrow will surely have their own footing, varying comfort levels and reasons for their choices of how to move forward. And just like it's been for the past 2 years, we will continue to have the choice of how to confront this variance when we see it. We can choose to be judgmental, or we can choose to be kind. We can focus on what we want to or are permitted to do, or we can be inclusive and default to what makes those around us feel safe and comfortable. We can assume that everyone feels the same way we do, or we can open our hearts, open our ears, and listen, and do our best to honor the vast diversity of those with whom we share this space. We can go out on our own for the sake of convenience, or we can come back together for the sake of something higher, something deeper. As I've said before, while it is true that the virtual world can be a facilitator of community, and for some this may very well be their only vehicle for participation still, I want to tell those of you with a choice, those of you here, but those of you streaming in particular, and I say this with love and with care and respect, there is no way to create a fully sacred, holy connection that does not involve the sacred power of hearing each other's voices, blending those voices together in the collective, that does not involve the ability to look into the face of one's fellow human being, eye to eye, face to face, with no impediment or filter between you. To make community, to vayakel, it necessarily demands not just receiving, but giving of ourselves. It means not only coming to Shabbat on the times when we need it or when we want it, but to come on the times when we really don't need or want anything because someone else does. Interestingly enough, it's through acts of selflessness like that that yield for us the highest forms of personal meaning and fulfillment. That's where you find the greatest ROI. And this is what it means to vayakel, to make community together. As we embark on the new path before us, I pray, I really do, we will each step forward with kindness and courage, with hope and with love, as we set our eyes toward the horizon of the beckoning new day of good health, good blessing for us all. Shabbat shalom.